Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Steve Lamb. I'm the dean and of graduate studies and the associate vice president of research here at Carr. Before I begin, I'd like to start by recognizing the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and current territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations, on which I'm speaking, learning, and working from. We live in an era that controls the visibility, bodies, and cultures of Indigenous and minoritized communities. So I want to acknowledge the land and to hear the traditional names of the territories as a way to insist on an Indigenous resurgence, as a way to suspend the everyday violence of organized forgetting. So thank you all for sharing your time with us. I'm so excited to speak with filmmaker, author, educator, Lana Lin. I'm so grateful that Lana and Lana's work has had such an impact and role in my own personal life. Her work has constantly asked me to sort of reflect on issues of justice, love, community responsibility. All three are necessary conditions in living a wise and ethical life in this deeply troubling time. So before I introduce Lana, I'd like to thank the Contingencies of Care team. I spent the past weekend spending a lot of time with Audrey, with Audrey's poetry, spending a lot of time watching the film, and also watching X-Men with my 7-year-old. And Ashok, the Dean of Graduate Students, you're like Professor X. Thank you so much for kind of convening this amazing virtual residency. Not just about care, but it kind of models care for the community. I'd like to thank Tanya, Peter, Andrea, Myung-sung, and Candice for their generosity and life force and their wisdom. It's so wonderful to sort of hold space and hold time together. And I'm so grateful for the OCAD RAs that have created this amazing platform affiliated with the residency. And also, I need to thank my colleagues in Carr for bringing the work of Professor Lin. Much appreciation to faculty member Allison Hroblick, the Carr grad staff, and of course the students affiliated with the low-res graduate program. Okay, a quick bio. Lana Lin is a filmmaker, artist, writer, and associate professor of film and cinema in the School of Media Studies at New School, New York. She has been making experimental films since the 1990s, and since 2001, she has collaborated on multidisciplinary research-based projects as the collaborative Lin plus Lam, exploring the contingencies of history and collective memory. Lana is also the author of, hold on, Freud's Jaw and Other Lost Objects, Fractured Subjectivity in the Face of Cancer, published in 2017. So we're here to talk about the Cancer Journals Revisited, which is still available through Emily Carr and through Contingencies of Care until June 16th. And the circulation life of the Cancer Journals Revisited in the past sort of year and a half is quite impressive. It screened in Band Cinema Fest in 2019, right? As well as screening in the Barcelona International Women's Film Festival, the Internationale Frauen Film Festival in Cologne, Germany, Cinema Politica in Concordia in Montreal, the Fringe Queer Film and Arts Festival in London, and the San Diego Asian Film Festival, as well as many other festivals. It received the Best Documentary Feature at the San Diego Film Festival and the Favorite Experimental Film Award at Black Star Film Festival. So I wanted to, before we kind of kick off the conversation, I wanted to read a mini sort of blurb that Christina Rhee wrote about the film, because it's just really such a beautiful synopsis about the power of the film. Quote, "Very rarely does a film honor a literary work through close reading. The Cancer Journals Revisited accomplishes this while also capturing the ways recitation itself can renew. Mixing archival footage, oration, and visual poetics, Lin delivers the special privilege of listening in, as Lorde's words modulate through the voices of present-day women from all walks of life, A lover's hesitation, the politics of implants, racialized medical care, economic precarity. These are the contradictions of flesh under extra duress from oppression felt at the cellular level. Together, they consider how a body transformed by cancer might write back onto the world with Black feminist and queer politics. So wonderfully put by Christina Rhee. Okay, so before we kind of kick off into the Q&A, a brief note about practicalities. We'll speak for roughly 45 minutes, maybe an hour, and then we'll leave room for 20 minutes for Q&A. So when we segue to the Q&A session, we'll kind of create a speakers list through the panel on the right. All right, you ready, Lana? You ready for our Q&A? All right, I'm gonna do a little share screen. It's always interesting to try to do a post-screening talk when the screening is kind of asynchronous. So we've compiled some images just to help us recall the impressions and feelings from the film. So I'm gonna do a little share screen while we're chatting. Okay. Excellent. Okay, so let's sort of do a little history lesson first. Let's talk about the context of Audrey, the context of the 70s and 80s, the context of the publication of the cancer journals. What were some of the challenges that Audrey was tending with, what was she trying to sort of dismantle and articulate around that time?
Yeah, okay. First of all, thank you so much, Stephen, for your own very close reading of the Cancer Journals Revisited, and for inviting me into Emily Carr and OCAD and the contingencies of care. What a great occasion to be able to talk about the Cancer Journals, this film, and Audre Lorde. So thank you. I guess I'll start with, in 1976, Audre Lorde attended the MLA conference, and she was provoked by a question posed by Barbara Smith, who said, "Is it possible to be a Black lesbian writer and live to tell about it?" So this really struck a chord with Audre Lorde, who felt that she realized that she had not been telling her stories loudly enough. She had been published as a poet and had her work widely circulated, but she felt that her audiences were consisting mostly of white lesbians. So she really felt like an incentive to get her work out there and to reach her own audience. At the same time, probably many of you know that she was already always very politically minded, and current events of her time were really weighed heavily on her. And she was incensed by police violence, and this is what makes her so pertinent today, and increasingly so. I mean, you've probably all seen memes of Audre Lorde constantly now flooding social media as we are experiencing these protests against white police violence against Blacks. And so at that very time in 1976, she was incensed by the killing of a young Black boy named Randy Evans. Later, she would write a poem called Power, motivated by the killing of Clifford Glover. And she was also really deeply affected by the killing of children in South Africa. So these kinds of violences were weighing on her. And then in December of 1977, she had a cancer scare. And so she went in for her biopsy at Beth Israel, and it turned out to be benign, but the experience of confronting this potential violence against her own body and of her own embodied vulnerability sparked this lecture that became The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. And at the kind of encouragement of the poet Adrienne Rich, who was a close friend of hers, she went to the 1977 MLA conference and presented that lecture, the beginning of which we hear in an audio clip in my film, The Cancer Journals Revisited. So she was really speaking from the kind of very fraught position of having faced her own death and realizing that there was no point in waiting to speak against what troubled her in her private life and in the world. And the two are kind of inseparable for her. So she was speaking out against the racism that she experienced in the white women's movement and amongst lesbians. She was also speaking out against the sexism and homophobia that she experienced in the Black community. So these were her political motivations that sort of became very much entwined with her personal experience of being diagnosed with breast cancer, which actually, so the initial tumor was benign, but then the next year she had diagnosed with a malignant tumor and had a mastectomy, and then the writing of those journals became the cancer journals.
I mean, I love this idea, and I think this is a frequent motif in your own research and work, Lana, is the role of text as a equipment for living, right? Not only is it a space, the page is a space for personal reflection, but it kind of models a way of living, right? It models a way of survival, and that kind of connection between the private, our kind of inner reflections, and its impact in the world is so beautifully suggested in the film. Can we let's sort of leave Audrey a bit, but I know she'll be perpetually present while talking throughout the whole conversation. Can we sort of pivot to your own biography and your own sort of artistic sort of thinking when you were preparing the film? You started filming in 2016. Was that right, or earlier?
Yeah. The filming, I believe, started in 2016. The research was many years prior. I probably was deeply into research on Audre Lorde and in 2012, and I was researching a dissertation at the time. I had gotten my MFA many years prior, and then I came back and decided to do this PhD, and during the writing of the PhD, or the research aspect, I was diagnosed with cancer. So my initial research was around psychoanalysis, and then I was diagnosed, and I'm doing a lot of reading on cancer, and it just sort of struck me. Sigmund Freud lived with cancer for 16 years, and not that many people think about that, and that much of his later writing was written as he had cancer. So I started to think of what illness meant in creative life and intellectual life, and so a chapter was devoted to Sigmund Freud, and then another to the queer and literary theorist Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, and then another to Audre Lorde. And then that became my book, Freud's Jaw and Other Lost Objects. So in doing the research, I obviously read the cancer journals, and it struck me that I felt like an importance in hearing that, hearing the text read, like actually literally hearing voices, hearing it voiced in our contemporary moment, because it just jumped off the page how relevant it was for our and that was 2012, and 2013, 14, it just continues to be relevant, and even more so. So I was writing this book, so I just sort of put that in the back of my mind that I would want to return and make something in film that I couldn't do in the writing. Make an audio and visual piece that have happened over a certain kind of durational period, and in the way that I couldn't do in writing. It's important to me that it's a kind of, in an ideal world, that it's a collective experience, that it happens sequentially over a certain amount of time, and that, you know, you are, like in any cinematic experience, that you are an individual receiving some information and an experience, but that's taking place also collectively. So what else was I gonna say? I mean, so in the preparation of the film, so I had the research, and then, and I did a lot of the research over quite some time. So I went to the Spelman Archives in Atlanta, where most of Lorde's papers are held. Then I also visited the Lesbian History Archives in Brooklyn, where not as much, but they have a smaller collection of her material. And then when in like 2016, I think it was, the summer, one of the hottest summers in New York, like temperatures like in the 90s Fahrenheit. And I thought, oh, this is a good time to start working on this project. And I took out this, and I talk about this in the film, I took out this raw stock that I had been carrying around with me in various conditions, inside a refrigerator and outside, this unexposed raw stock that I'd had for like probably 20 years. And I like to embark on a project with certain parameters, almost like a set of rules. And then these are kind of like the frame in which I can then sort of just find accidents and discover random things, but there's always a sort of structure in place. So one of these like kind of parameters was that I was going to start by shooting the rest of this film. You know, and the film was just in an unknown condition. It hadn't been refrigerated. It, you know, I had no idea whether it would really retain an image. So I just, you know, I just sort of set about to do this and to shoot in the streets of New York. And New York was where Lorde spent most of her life. She was born there. She, you know, she lived in Staten Island. She lived in the East Village. She lived in Harlem. And, you know, so a great deal of her adult life and childhood was spent in New York City. So most of the film was shot. And then after that point is when I started sitting down with people to read the text.
Okay, yeah. I love this idea of that the revisitation or the recitation, and also really curious about how you're talking about film, whether through its kind of materiality or through its sort of the sensation of viewing, can be a social project. And I think one way that's sort of mobilized in this particular film is through quotations, right? Film is a social project insofar as like it's not just media that's intended to be consumed. You know, we live in this new kind of Netflix watch list, right? Where we're just kind of downloading and binge watching things. There's no, it's very, very far from kind of a close dialectical read of text across generations, right? So I'm going to read this really wonderful quote that I think is halfway through the film, and I believe it may be halfway through Cancer Journals as well. Lorde wrote this, basically sort of trying to contextualize what does it mean to create an archive, what does it mean to create an inventory, to create a legacy, and who is that legacy for? Lorde wrote, quote, "I am writing now in a new year, recalling, trying to piece together that chunk of my recent past, so that I, or anyone else in need or desire, can dip into it at will, if necessary, to find the ingredients for which to build a wider construct." I just love this idea of how she's journaling, she's writing, she's creating this repository, this reservoir, right? Perhaps this resource of her own personal reflections, her own critiques, so that anyone else can kind of tap into it. They can dip into it at will. to find the ingredients to build a wider construct, to build a new frame to kind of look at the world. And I think the film performs a similar function of this recall. You invited 27 participants to read passages from the journal. And then following the recitation of a select passage, you asked them to sort of reflect on their own lived experience, either as healthcare advocates, artists, or current or former patients. So let's talk about the word revisited in the title of the film. You know, it's Cancer Journals Revisited, not Cancer Journals Revised. Can you talk about the word revisited and its significance? What does it mean to sort of revisit something? And how does this collective dramatization help build this idea of a wider construct where we can sort of think about the past and present? So sort of thinking about quotations and revisitations, and why is that kind of historical consciousness important in your writing and in your work?
I mean, I love that you pulled that particular quote and made me think about it as this, she says, a wider construct, and to think about that construct as being a temporal construct. And I do hope that the film is operating as a kind of building of a wider temporal construct, and that the Reader's Act is a kind of bridge between the audience and Lorde, and in doing that, they're bridging the present and the past. I was thinking about a passage. It is almost the first. It is the first. The first reader is Elizabeth Lord Rollins, who is on the screen in this empty theater, who is Audre Lorde's daughter. So she's the first reader who comes on screen, and oh no, she's the second one. Sorry, my mistake. But she's the first that we kind of sit down with is the audience, and she reads it, and then when she is done, she says, "It's great to read that." And for me, it was like the reading was doing a kind of reparative work in bridging that time of the now and then, and it kind of holds for her the loss of her mother. So the revisiting is kind of, holding that loss of her mother and doing a kind of a reparative work, I feel like.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering, one thing that is really interesting is that that sort of slippage between being anonymous versus being identified, right? The viewer does not know who the speakers are until the very end. Was that a conscious decision to try to have that equal treatment of perhaps anonymity? I can never pronounce that word because maybe I'm afraid of it. That's why. So I find it really kind of interesting in terms of we didn't know who was speaking, right?
Yeah.
What were your thoughts in terms of that?
It was a conscious decision. I mean, definitely it is hoped that you understand that Elizabeth Lord Rollins is the daughter of Audre Lorde, because she's the only reader who I actually, I had a very particular passage in mind in which she points to herself. So Audre Lorde writes about her daughter in this passage, and Elizabeth Lord Rollins says, "My mother." But all the other readers are exactly what you describe. I hope that they're on equal plane. So in a way, of course it matters who they are, but I also wanted viewers to just experience them as a collective voice, each with their own character and their own perspective, but not to sort of associate them with who they were so much. And then they're credited at the end, and I hope that, if you want to pursue their own work, that you can, because, they're named. But in the course of the film, I kind of, I wanted to divorce them from those associations with who they were. I also wanted, because you mentioned something, and I just wanted to sort of get into a little bit of a detail, that when with each of the readers, I asked them to read a passage. And then I didn't ask them to reflect on their own health and experience of cancer. I never asked them that, and that was very intentional. I asked them what it was like to read that passage. What did the passage bring to mind? In fact, I think that was always what I asked them. What did the passage bring to mind? And so, of course, many of them, having been having had cancer, reflected on the resonances between what Audre Lorde was writing about and in their own experience. But I did very specifically not want to ask them about their own experience, not because it's not important or that, that was wrong, but I mean, that would have been a very kind of conventional approach in the documentary sense, is like, please tell me about who you are and what your cancer experience was. And for me, it was about, and it goes to this idea of the close reading, it was about, what does this text mean to you and what does it mean to you now in this present moment? And that goes to the way in which I hope that it uses the past to reflect on the present.
It's reading as a form of repair, the text as a memory device, and I think it also I know in several interviews you used the phrase self-revelation a lot, and how rather than just a straight up journalistic inquiry of like, how do you respond? You're letting the readers kind of reflect on their own condition and to sort of understand how art is a vehicle for self-revelation. So maybe we can kind of riff on that phrase a bit more, because I think it's a very different type of self-revelation than, say, like expressionism, where I'm just expressing my feelings, right? It's one that we can even think about, like I think about Mary Kelly's work, right? How it's a sort of deep interdisciplinary kind of feminist praxis where theory is activated by artistic modes of production. Can you expand on this idea of self-revelation and how the personal has been important, not just for you, but also the personal is recalled by all of the readers. And then secondly, I think this is the word trauma informed is popping up a lot right now. What does that sort of self-revelation mean when it comes down to thinking about trauma informed creativity? Creativity doesn't necessarily, we often think about creativity as this sort of this stemming from this neutral and safe space rather than a space of suffering and a space of illness. It's a lot. Those are big questions.
Yeah, really. So, always going back to Lorde, because one should do that. The idea about self-revelation really comes from her, and then the quote is, "The transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and that always seems fraught with danger." So, I carried that with me as I was making the film, that I wasn't, I didn't make the film to tell my own story or to tell the stories of the various participants, but self-revelation was a vehicle through which to engage with political concerns as well as our own personal experience of them. For Lorde, speech and language, speaking up, speaking your truth, is a way of activating your political agency, and that is directly bound up with revealing yourself to yourself, and in the form of trying to come to some self-understanding, but also revealing yourself to a public. It's making yourself vulnerable, and it's taking a risk. So in this current moment of COVID, COVID really brings into relief who is at risk, and who is more at risk. So I think that, again, I keep coming to why Lorde is pertinent now. is that this idea of self-revelation, of making yourself vulnerable, of exposing your risk, is really important. And I think it's also really moving that for Lorde, that she doesn't separate that from fear. That it's always, says, as she says, it's always fraught with danger, and there's fear involved in that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's so powerful. And even just watching the readers latch onto certain sections, and for them to bring up some of their own feelings of fear and courage, it's just really powerful and moving. So maybe we can sort of talk about this idea of revelation, the revelation of vulnerability, revealing as a sense of healing, and how that is the opposite of the prosthetic. And I'm sort of thinking a few thoughts, right? In the film and of course in the book, breast reconstruction, breast prosthetics are quite scrutinized and sort of analyzed. And I immediately think about this one scene where a reader is rereading a passage from the journal when Audre Lorde meets a Reach the Recovery volunteer. So this was, I think, shortly after Audrey's mastectomy, and she was visited by a volunteer from this community advocacy program, Reach the Recovery. And the volunteer is also a breast cancer survivor, was making a pitch for Audrey to utilize a breast prosthetic. Audrey writes, "I wonder if there are Black lesbian feminists in Reach to Recovery," because there's a lot of presumption. And I'm sort of thinking about this idea of recovery versus reveal or revelation. If you think about the word in a very kind of stupid sense, recovery, and the word cover, you're basically covering something up. You're covering up a wound, right? And it's really curious how that becomes forgotten or erased or invisibilized when we think about recovery, about healing, about maintenance, right? What is the role of the prosthetic, and how might Lorde sort of in your film tackle with the problems of the prosthetic? I'm going to read one more quote by Lorde. This is when she's sort of arguing about employment discrimination, and how employment discrimination against women who have had a mastectomy, and they feel like they need to sort of purchase or utilize a prosthetic. She wrote, "Employment discrimination cannot be fought with a silicone gel. Suggesting prosthesis as a solution to employment discrimination is like saying the way to fight prejudice for Black people is to pretend to be white." It's powerful, So how does the prosthesis kind of perpetuate this idea of neglect, and it sort of avoids other realities? Like, what role did the prosthesis have in your thinking about the film and thinking about ideas of vulnerability? Another big one.
Yeah. I mean, this Lorde's stance on the prosthetic was probably a huge motivating factor for me to make the film. I mean, it certainly spoke to me personally, and her claim is so powerful and still so controversial today. That, I mean, she was definitely a critic of the use of the prosthetic, and then as you read her more carefully, she's not saying that women should not use a prosthesis, but that she was really critical of the reason why that it was kind of imposed on women post-surgery. But really her claim is that people should make their suffering visible. And that their suffering should not be cloaked in shame, and that we can't just pretend to be so-called normal. And that in making your suffering visible, or in making the ways in which you may be non-normative visible and available to other people, would be a way to act in solidarity, and that people would know that who their comrades were. So for me, I mean, in my book, I say that the demand for symmetry is a kind of tyranny. Like we're made to feel like we need to conform to a certain kind of aesthetic norm, and that might be the aesthetic norm of having two breasts, but it could also be the norm of fitting within a gender binary. So Lorde is really railing against the idea that we have to conform to these certain norms. And as you suggested in your notes, but maybe not right at this moment, it really also has to do with how prosthesis and breast reconstruction deflected from a real focus on researching how to prevent cancers and how to really treat cancer, because it became very confusing when, you know, health insurance starts acting like breast prosthesis at the time, and now very much breast reconstruction is billed as treatment. And it's not to say that women can't choose it or don't deserve that to be covered, but that it can't be thought of as a treatment of the illness itself. You know, it is a way in which women, you know, might want to deal with the aftermath of mastectomy, but it is not a, you know, getting a breast reconstructed is not treating your cancer.
Yeah, it's sort of I mean, I think that's also another powerful kind of influence for Lorde, is it also kind of predicts the new sort of medical condition that we live in now. She wrote, "We live in a profit economy. There is no profit in the prevention of cancer. There is profit in the treatment of cancer," right? And that immediately thinks, maybe, I recently, I'm not sure if you read this, Lana, there's in the current issue of Art Forum, there's a wonderful text by Paul Prachado, Learning from the Virus. And then Paul introduces a term, pharmacopornographic, right, where there's a new sort of management of bodies where it's sort of like the pharmacological, where we're looking for cures, but the kind of cures create their own challenges, they create their own kind of fictions, they create their own kind of false closures. And it's also pornographic because our desires are kind of linked and connected for this immediate kind of satiation through these tools, be they vaccines, Viagra, right? Big pharma kind of products. So it's really interesting in terms of how that kind of critique of the prosthesis led to this sort of powerlessness when thinking about community care. So one thing that I wanted to bring up is that kind of connection between visibility and community formation. Lorde's Elizabeth Lorde, right, was saying that Lorde was really relied on the sustenance of the community of women to kind of thrive. Can you talk about that relationship between invisibility and creating communities, and how some of those community formations are foreclosed when publics are starting to use treatments as a way to kind of solve the problem rather than kind of creating networks of care?
I'm not sure how to respond to that.
Let's hold on that, Lana, because I think when I show the image of the mural, I think we can sort of talk about care work, right? And how care work is invisible, and how Audrey sort of anticipated some of those challenges. One thing I wanted to talk about is the one thing that's really striking about the film is that a lot of the readings were conducted in private space, or at least not outside, not in the public square. One really amazing passage, I think it was an interview with Vanessa, in which the reciter or the reader was talking about the relevance of the cancer journals, cancer journals, and how Audrey was quite insistent to kind of refuse to keep sickness at the level of the individual. Audrey refused to kind of keep sickness strictly relegated to the private realm. And what Lorde kind of modeled was a way to kind of jump from the breast to the body to governmental agencies, to sort of start to draw the links regarding exposures to toxicity and sort of governmental policies, is almost like a blueprint to sort of think about multi-scalier impacts. So watching the film, I mean, I was, especially in this age of quarantine, you know, I was really kind of struck by how the intimacy was of the readers, or kind of structured in enclosures. They were reading from their apartments. They were reading from the confines of their homes. They're reading from their offices or their own kind of personal libraries. Right now, we're just in this like moment of complete public protest, and I just found myself so really struck by how political it was for these readings to happen in these kind of intimate spaces of their own kind of private space. Was that intentional, and how might the scale of the individual kind of also supplement these mandates for social upheaval for the crowd? I just love the fact that it's so focused on the personal, but it's still not just about private edification, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Each of your question kind of explodes into all these different directions. I have to say that the way that the readers are filmed, and well, the whole film is there's a certain level of convenience and yeah, I mean, we all know medical space is privatized. So the way in which I shot a lot of the medical institutions was outside in public space. I can't enter the private space of the hospital. Sorry, I hope.
Speaking of private space.
Yeah, right. We're both in meetings. So, you know, there was that aspect, is that I couldn't go into the kind of this private space of the hospital, of the, you know, chemo suite, that would violate patient privacy. So in that sense, I was barred from a private space. And then, as you saw, like the exteriors are all, you know, they're shot viewing the facades of medical institutions for the most part. But on the other side, with the readers, as you know, they are in domestic spaces, mostly because I could control the sound. I mean, so it's really very practical concern. I mean, there's a whole tradition of street interviews and documentaries like Chronicle of Summer. But, you know, I knew that I wanted a more extensive reading, and that had to have a certain level of clarity in the sound. And I wanted it to feel a little bit more like a poetry reading, you know, where you could hear like the cadence and the actual words and the breath between the words. And I could only do that without the distractions of being on the street. And I hoped that in having this very kind of clear line of narration that was in a very kind of intimate interior space, that it would allow the viewer to be in an introspective state of mind. And so the visuals could then travel elsewhere. They travel outside in urban space and in nature, and are kind of, so that the sound and the image are kind of detached from each other, and, you know, hopefully give a more level of freedom in interpretation.
Speaking of,
yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I think it's also interesting how these practical solutions kind of open up to all these conceptual kind of questions. It's really wonderful. So I think
Oh, but one thing that you were saying that made me think about, the the public sphere is different than public space. And so
yeah,
maybe in this COVID moment, we're starting to realize ways in which, the public sphere can be interior.
yeah,
That we create this public sphere in Zoom, good God. But, there are, things happening in this space of the online constriction
yeah.
that could build a public sphere. Yes, it's great when we can get on the streets and protests are happening, and it's important to be on the street, but and that gets into this whole disability focus that some of us can't be on the street, and some of us are too at risk in various ways to go on the street. And so a public sphere can be built outside of public space.
And that also goes back to Audrey's kind of call for multi-scalar interventions and sort of thinking to think from the cellular to these kind of broader collectives, and how collectives are formed just through the intimacy of readings. I think you're right. Like, we shouldn't collapse and just consider being outside is public. There's other public spheres that are in formation. Yeah. Um, so, can we talk about this image a bit? I,
Sure.
I love it, right? I think one thing that for the audience, I was asking Lana, like, where is this image? I don't remember seeing it, and Lana said it's at the very end, Can you sort of talk about this image a bit in terms of what is it, what does it mean, your own kind of interpretations and associations with this kind of cardboard box?
Yeah, I mean, I was saying that this image is kind of iconic for me for the film, even though it actually doesn't appear in the body of the film. And it was my kind of attachment to the image that, made me, despite the fact that I was not going to use it in the film, I had to put it somewhere as a kind of note, a footnote, so it's like at the very end, at the last credit. Where I actually credit the cancer journals. And so this box is in the Lesbian History Archives in Brooklyn, and it contained the manuscript for the cancer journals. As you can sort of see, it says cancer journal, and those are kind of split apart. But it's so iconic because it is the image of the archive, and it contained this work, and yet it's clearly visibly suffered. And so you see the ways in which it's deteriorating and broken. And then I had returned to the archives actually to try to get more, maybe get some footage of this and not just a photo. But the box had like completely fallen into disrepair and was literally flattened and put into a hanging file folder. So it was no longer really even a box. It was just a flat piece of cardboard. So to me, it's just like emblematic of the ways in which material bodies, like our humans' bodies, but also, as I say in the film, the way celluloid film and other material bodies disintegrate and suffer harm and bear the visual marks of their wounding.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I also love this as a footnote. It's it's great. Okay, so then two more slides, and then I think we should open it up. I think we can talk forever, Lana. So there's the film also has this one still. I believe this is in the Harlem Hospital, right? And I was immediately kind of, this is where I'm sort of using the contemporary resonance and kind of like imposing it on the film that's a few years old, right? And looking at the mural, I was struck by it for two reasons. of course, the most obvious reason is the symbol of the mask. The doctors, the men have the mask. They have access to PPE. But the Black women of color, the immigrant women of color, who are always invisibilized in this sort of, who are kind of marked as essential but disposable kind of care workers, does not have a mask. So I think looking at this image, I was immediately, it's funny because I'm also performing what the reader does, right? Sort of using my own kind of associations, using my own kind of interpretations while looking at this content. When looking at this image, I was immediately kind of struck by two images that are in our immediate media ecology. One is of frontline healthcare workers in New York, I believe, right, or in Queens, who had to create makeshift PPE with garbage bags, right? And how that kind of butts up with the police, images of the police now, images of the police that seem to have an endless stream of supplies with their riot gear, you know, and what does that kind of juxtaposition say about our society's investment in care? Secondly, looking at this image, I was immediately kind of reminded about the WPA, about the 30s, at least the 30s in the States. And attended this wonderful kind of teach-in yesterday with Naomi Klein and Ajing Pu, who's a labor activist. And Ajing Pu said, let's not, when thinking about the 30s, especially right now in this context when many governments are looking at responses to economic, ecological health crises through sort of large kind of federal initiatives, such as the WPA, that we shouldn't sort of be too nostalgic with the WPA. And I think art workers also tend to have the same sort of trappings of nostalgia. And Ajing Pu said, let's not forget about the anti-Black exclusions in the US with laws dating around the New Deal. Around that time, when Congress was trying to create these bold labor laws to protect workers, to create jobs for workers, they also caved to Southern members of Congress that refused to support the laws that included supports for farm workers and home care workers, because they did not want to support the equal protection of Black workers. So I think we still kind of live in that shadow. Ajing Pu calls it this workforce, the healthcare workforce, the domestic workforce. Care work is also living in the shadow of racial exclusion. So I think looking at this image of the mural, reading Audrey, hearing the reader speak, just reminded me of the importance of sort of building that construct, right, from a BIPOC feminist lens, and making sure that kind of radiates out throughout the whole public sphere. So I think I wanted to just sort of ask you, how would you read this film or read this image again, you know, in the current context?
Yeah, I mean, you pointed out that there are masks, that the doctors have masks and the woman doesn't, and I had not even noticed that at the time, which is quite amazing, the way that our visual register is reshifted. But so you are right that, I mean, I didn't know it at the time, that these murals are reproductions of Works Progress Administration commissioned murals that, so in the interior of the Harlem Hospital, they were there and painted in 1936, and then in 2012, they were restored and put on the outside and the facade of the building, and they're gigantic, you know, like they're a city block long and 5 stories high, and they're on the glass facade. So these are digital enlargements. And it, you know, going back to like how I said I had certain kinds of parameters, and then there's also a certain like openness to randomness. I went specifically to film the Harlem Hospital, but I didn't know these murals were there. I just was like astounded when I saw them, because they are quite impressive. So this image of the nurse her name's Myra Logan, the artist is Charles Alston, and he would later marry this nurse who then who was an intern at the time and then became a surgeon. I focused in on her obviously because I was drawn to, her being this Black woman, and how the woman is always sort of the helpmate of the almost always male surgeon, especially at that time. Yeah, I sort of lost my train of thought, but
Yeah.
I can't remember what else you might have been asking.
Yeah, and I also went back and I didn't show some of these images, but earlier on in the film, there's this beautiful kind of collage, not beautiful, hilarious and satirical collage of white women that are always the cancer
Oh,
patients, right?
yeah.
And that is a frequent kind of motif, frequent trope that has been redeployed over and over again throughout the history of Hollywood. But another kind of motif is the Black hair worker who
Exactly.
is disproportionately caring for families from crisis to crisis to crisis to crisis, right?
Oh,
And
right.
I
And
knew that, yeah,
that's what I wanted to respond to when you're discussing how we're looking differently at essential workers right now, and it
yeah,
really brings into the forefront that care is not just an act of love, which it might be, but it is labor.
mhm,
Care is work. Care,
yeah,
it's not called care work for nothing.
yeah.
And Christina Crosby writes about this in her book The Body Undone, and obviously many other people, but about the labor of caring for
Yeah.
another.
And again, I think a little bit of it, it's kind of the violence of whitewashing, it's the violence of amnesia, the violence of forgetting. Even the word emotional labor has sort of been kind of disremembered. I think now we say emotional labor is, oh, we have to perform more affect. Some people have to perform more affect than others. But no, emotional labor did kind of was sort of struck by this idea of home care work, right? There
Mm-hmm.
are material exclusions with that. Okay, final final slide, and then we can open up. I think one of the most haunting and moving, the whole film is very moving, and hearing each reader sort of give a testimony. But I think the final two shots are particularly moving. I also think it's the sound design, and the score is beautiful, so wonderful, right? Um, the closing shot is, this is after the 27th reader has read a text. We see a forest. At first, the forest seems serene. It's quiet. It's natural, right? And then we start to detect movement. In the horizon, trees are starting to sway. One thinks it's just part of the natural order of wind, and flow and rhythm. But in reality, it seems like it's an act of deforestation. We start to see the trees get chopped down one by one. We can't tell who's doing it. We hear the sound, and then it cuts to the final shot, which is, I'm not going to represent it because I want for those of you who haven't seen the film, we should see it. It cuts from this to your body. And sort of just breathing. And then you can also see glimmers of a window and also see trees. Can you sort of talk about these two shots and sort of just close up the conversation by sort of saying, like, why did you want to close the film with these two shots? And there isn't really much text. I think there's one text that ends by Audre Lorde talking about how to battle despair, which is really beautiful, but I'll save it for those of you to watch it later on. Can you talk about
Yeah.
your decisions regarding these two final sequences?
Yes, another big question. So you hear over this forest image, you hear Elizabeth Lord Rollins. So it felt to me important to return to Elizabeth Lord Rollins as kind of framing the film, bringing together the daughter and the mother. But it is the only passage in the film where I take the words out of their chronological context as they appear in the book. In the book, it is at the beginning, and I place it at the end. So there's something kind of unique about this passage that so I used that. I allowed myself to take it out of context. And then I want to say that the forest, it's an image of clear cutting. And clear cutting is meant to, as I understand it, it's actually meant to revive the forest and to enable it to grow. So it's a destructive process that actually should have a productive effect. And it's not a natural process. It is a human intervention, but it's meant to keep the forest fruitful in a way, productive. So that kind of doubleness of destruction having a kind of creative capacity was important to me. And then also, that the sound design is quite important there. I had a long debate with the sound designer about it, and only on my own, and I actually had a different sound mixer than the sound designer. She had so very carefully sunk up all the falling trees with sound, because if you ever heard clear cutting, you don't hear the individuals. You hear the individual sound of trees falling, but you hear huge motors of the vehicle crashing through that. It's just like a really deafening sound. So I had removed all of the sound. It was silent. And she had carefully put in the realistic sound of falling trees. And then I took it all out. For me, it was really important to kind of abstract the image from its kind of realistic rendering. So it's not a naturalistic image sound document of clear cutting a forest. It's symbolic. So there is one moment that you hear the sound of a falling tree, but you only hear it after you actually no longer see the forest, and you're inside the space with the body, which is lying on the floor and meant to be a kind of body as landscape. And then it's 98-minute long film, and probably 96 minutes of it is spoken word. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but it's a film that's so overfilled with words and spoken words. And I came to this point where I was like, I need a point of silence, of rest. And I asked myself, what are all those words doing? And I decided that they weren't so much telling us about pain. They weren't necessarily, they weren't descriptive in function. They weren't necessarily meant to express what pain is like. It seemed to me that the words were meant to help. They were the medium through which one could bear pain. So that's what I mean in the end when I say on text on the screen, some kinds of pain are not so much expressed by words as born through words. That is, like, words can be the medium through which you survive.
Wonderful. That's great. I think that's how we should end it, Lana. It's just such a wonderful reframing of life and survival. Wow. Okay, great. So let's open it up to some conversation, shall we? For those of you, let me see how I can activate this. Okay, after so much eloquence, now I'm clumsily just trying to figure out how to use Zoom.
It's always...
Raise your hand if you want to. How do you do that? Raise your hand if you have any questions for either Lana or myself. Is that the way to do it? Or chat box. Yes. Put it in the chat. We're talking about eloquence and words as a way to sort of discover pain, and use a chat box. Oh, gosh.
I always find the chat easier than the raising the hand.
Yeah. Anyone have any questions? maybe while people are kind of mulling over questions,
We've silenced everyone.
We've silenced. I want to read what Elizabeth said. I want to read what Elizabeth reread, reading Audrey's words, thinking about survival. I found that battling despair does not mean closing my eyes to the enormity of the tasks of affecting change, nor ignoring the strength and the barbarity of the forces against us. It means teaching, surviving, and fighting with the most important resource we have, and that's myself, and taking joy in that battle. It means knowing my work is a continuum of women's work, of reclaiming this earth and our power, and knowing this work did not begin with my birth, nor will it end with my death. And it means knowing within this continuum that my work, my life, my love has particular power and meaning relative to others. So yeah, I felt like the last 8 minutes of that film, Lana, was like, oh, just wonderful. Heather has a question. It's about the archive and what your work is your work is interaction with an archive. Do you consider this work an interaction or the creation of a new archive? Yeah, going back to, that's a wonderful point.
I mean, I actually hope that it's both. I mean, it's most definitely an interaction for me with the archive. And I do hope that it can be a new kind of archive, you know, as Stephen was remarking, in which people can hopefully dip into it and, you know, create a wider construct amongst yourselves as well.
But I also love this idea of authorship being a communion with a communion of artists and intellectuals in the past. It's always ever present, right? Any other questions? Okay. All right. Okay, I think that's it. Well, thank you, Lana, so much for making time. So, oh, hold on, Megan has a question. Oh, yeah, thanks, Megan, for your thoughts. Ooh, we have a question from Cameron. Can you speak about your work? Can you speak more about your PhD and the practice-based nature of your research?
Oh, yeah. That is so complicated because I have a lot of conflicted feelings about practice-based research. I don't consider, it's not that my work isn't practice-based, because it clearly is, but I wrote a dissertation that was not in a practice-based program. It was a PhD written that was, you know, kind of a pretty conventional model. The only thing non-conventional about it was, you know, it was first person. It did dip into my own personal history. But I feel like my practice is parallel to my scholarship. So that's, I guess what I have trouble with is this idea of that practice. Practice-based programs often feel like, and this is, you know, not from real personal experience, but it feels like one thing is supporting another. Like either research is supporting practice or practice is supporting research, where I feel like they're on equal ground, which means that it takes like double or triple or quadruple the time to do any work. But yeah, so it's I mean, maybe this is just a bias that is like from ignorance, but that I don't consider one to be supporting another, but that they are parallel to each other, and they definitely inform each other, but not in a hierarchical sense, I guess. I mean, I could talk endlessly more about the PhD, but I probably should not.
Hey, Lana, what did Audrey teach in John Jay? John Jay is a criminal justice program.
I mean, she taught poetry and composition, I think, and
Yeah,
yeah,
it's amazing.
yeah,
I'm sort of thinking about how these questions of practice-based PhDs kind of butt up against the frame of the academy in a way. So it's interesting that Audrey also had her kind of position and voice within that very specific context. Yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
I mean,
yeah.
and she definitely spent. I mean, Audre Lorde started as and was a librarian. I don't know if you
Mm,
knew that. She was a librarian and an educator, and then taught at Hunter and John Jay.
mm,
Yeah.
that's great. Um, okay, I think, oh, Sharon has a question. Oh, yes. So Sharon, we do have uh, uh, a rental through, oh, I should also thank Women Make Movies, you know. So we still have access to the film to June 16th. I believe the OCAD, the Contingencies of Care website has a link to that Vimeo, or we also circulate it to all Emily Carr students as well. Feel free to kind of reach out to me or the Contingencies of Care team, and I can make sure that that Vimeo link is accessible for you all. For those of you who haven't seen the film, it's amazing. It's moving. Thank you, Lana, for doing it. You know, it's just a really wonderful. I'm not even sure "wonderful" is the right word. It's powerful.
Thank
It's a
you.
powerful film.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. Okay. All right. With that,
Okay.
thanks everyone for making time. Thank you all to the Contingencies of Care team. Thanks all for Emily Carr team as well. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks
All
so
right.
much.
Take care.
Bye.